Blomcast. Turning Points in History. Wendepunkte in der Geschichte. Hello and welcome to the Blomcast, the podcast that looks at turning points in history. And today I'm particularly excited to welcome to the Blomcast Roman Krznaric, the author of many books, most recently one that really fits this podcast perfectly. I should not put my hand over the title, History for Tomorrow. A book, a meditation, and a series of case studies that looks at what, if anything, history can teach us for tomorrow. What inspiration we can get from history. And Roman, thank you first of all so much for being on the Blomcast.
Well, it's a great pleasure and privilege. I'm looking forward to the adventure of this curious conversation.
Well, so am I, because there's so much to talk about. Now, historical comparisons are always a really hard nut because, first of all, they're a terrible temptation. And you will always see parallels, and sometimes parallels are meaningful. And I myself have been guilty of that, and I've written about the Little Ice Age, of course, in a way of looking at if the climate changes, if the natural environment changes, what happens to societies, what happens to human societies, how do they change? And it turns out, yes, they do, and they changed radically. And that sort of course, pushes the implication they will change radically again. They will change just as radically. So as the Little Ice Age met a world, at least in Western Europe, which is what I'm vaguely competent to write about, or in Europe, met a world that was late medieval and thought late medieval and whose trade structures were late medieval. It left a world that was an early modern world, with beginning capitalism, with the beginning Enlightenment, with urbanization, with much stronger emphasis on individual rights. So things have changed. I have a slight suspicion that you've written this book very much with that kind of thing in mind, that you are inviting people to think about the changes to come.
Absolutely. I mean, my mind is very much here in the present moment and in the challenges of our time, the polycrisis of our time, the climate and ecological emergency, the risks from AI and genetic engineering, the threats to democracy, growing inequality. And I think in a moment of polycrisis, when I see the politicians and policymakers trapped in the tyranny of the now, barely able to see beyond the next election or the latest tweet, or when I see them crossing their fingers and putting their faith in the tech bros in Silicon Valley, hoping that technology will solve our problems for us, geoengineering and things like that, my mind immediately goes from the present into the past to try and look for where we can find hope, where we can find possibilities of thinking about the challenges of our time in more innovative and effective ways. And I think in doing that, one's making a lot of assumptions about how to connect the present to the past. I mean, Goethe famously said in the early 19th century, "He who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth." And that idea that history is full of nourishment is an old one. And the idea that history can guide us, can navigate us, not to be a clairvoyant to tell us what will happen, but to be a counselor, to get us ready, in a sense. And that goes back, of course, to Thucydides.
Yes, but also, of course, there's a problem. And I think we have to sort of get past that, or at least address that. I mean, Thucydides and the Greek civilization was, for instance, the great paragon for Western civilization, for the 18th, 19th century, and of course, much earlier. And in many ways, these societies were still to some degree comparable. There was a European elite in the 18th century, just as there had been one in Athens, and you could make quite strong comparisons. I think it's sort of undeniable that what historians call the Great Acceleration, which basically coincides with the use of fossil fuels since the 1960s, that has created our consumer culture, our globalized world, etc., has shifted the goalposts so much that I just want to ask you, how much can we still, in a world that is facing existential annihilation, in a world in which there are only global answers, in which there are no local problems anymore, in a world where decisions are taken by huge corporations and less by states, etc., etc., in a world where technology is advancing exponentially while you and I are only sort of evolving linearly, in which way is it still sensible from that perspective to make these look towards a past that didn't know these phenomena?
Sure, and it's a fundamental question. I've been wrestling with it for the last 4 years of writing this book, History for Tomorrow. My starting point there, just to step back a bit, is to think about 3 different ways that we can learn from history. I mean, one of them is what I think of a genealogical way. In other words, you take a phenomenon today like consumer capitalism, our obsession with shopping. I shop, therefore I am. And then try and trace the history of that. How did we get here to that? And then, there are sort of moments one can look back to. One can look back to the invention of the public relations industry in the 1920s.
Edward Bernays, yes.
Edward Bernays, to go back to the 19th century, to Bon Marché, the rise of the first supermarkets, the rise of the idea of desire, going beyond human need in the 18th century in Western Europe. So that's the genealogical way. That is one way. I think a second way is the analogical way. Like, can we make the comparisons, which, what you've been talking about? Can we compare a phenomenon today to one in the past, to the way wars start today and the ways wars start in the past, to can we compare social media today to the rise of the printing press in the 15th, 16th century? And of course, analogy is always a very difficult topic because one needs to look for similarities as much as differences. And every war is not another Vietnam. Every dictator is not another Hitler. So one has to be very careful there. And then the third area is, so we've got genealogical thinking, then analogical thinking. The third way is, I think, of patterns, looking for patterns in history. And here I'm not talking about iron laws in a kind of Marxist sense. I think patterns hold for certain moments in space and time. So just to give you one example, which I write about in my book, is around the work of the political scientist Elinor Ostrom, who, of course, won the Nobel Prize for Economics. She noticed a kind of a pattern in the history of resource use, which she talked about the idea of the commons, common pool resources that communities manage in certain circumstances to develop rules, systems of rules for managing things like their water or their forests or their fisheries. And she sort of noticed a pattern of sort of 8 principles that are common, that there are sort of rules for being punished if you overuse the resource, or who's a member of the resource, who has access to it or not. And so you see these kinds of patterns in history, which I think she certainly have held for at least several hundred years and across cultures as well. One might then go directly to your question and say, well, let's think about something like artificial intelligence. Surely that is so high tech, so modern, so different from anything in the past that what is the point of thinking about that historically? That's exactly the question that I love, right? So for that question, just briefly, I thought to myself, okay, how do you think about AI historically? And one way to look at it, and this is not the only way, I asked myself, okay, when have human beings ever created large-scale systems, a bit like artificial intelligence, that resemble in some ways that have got out of control? Because this is one of the threats that people see. And of course, we've created large-scale systems that have got out of control. So the one I look at in my book is the rise of financial capitalism in Amsterdam in the early 17th century, when they invented the first stock markets, the first public limited companies, marine insurance, a kind of an apparatus, instruments for Dutch trade. They were trying to solve a problem. And of course, that system quickly got out of control. You've got the tulip bubbles, the Mississippi bubble crash in the 1720s. And you can start thinking about AI. Are we creating, are there going to be the same kinds of financial collapses, but in the world of AI. Now, of course, AI is not going to collapse in the same way as a financial system like the Wall Street crash in 1929. Maybe the collapses look different. So, for example, one might say, okay, due to the potential and the growing exponential spread of fake information, fake political videos, fake stock market reports, fake everything, we may have not a financial collapse, but a reality collapse.
Well, you've had the beginning of that. We're recording this in the beginning of August, and you've had the beginning of that in Stockport right now, where a fake tweet after a horrible murder, a fake tweet that said that the attacker had a Muslim name, has caused nights of violent riots with many people injured, many people arrested. So yes, this is just a tweet. This isn't even a video showing you how Joe Biden declares the Third World War. But this is just the most simple form of disinformation, but it's become so pervasive that yes, it can cause unrest for a week.
Absolutely. And of course, one can start drawing another analogies with fake news and fake information. Go back to the 16th century when you had in Germany the huge spread of fake news stories about so-called witches, right? And this was very important for the commercial printing press industry in the 16th century to spread broadsheet news stories about the Maid of Schiltach, who in 1530 or so on apparently burnt down some, small town or small village, and she traveled there on a broomstick or rode a goat or something like that. And these stories spread across Europe. Even Erasmus believed that one. And but that was the fake news or the clickbait of their time.
But this is fantastically important because the internet. When the internet came up, and we are both, sad thing to be able to say, we're both able to remember that. There was this great utopia, now everybody will be educated. Now everybody has access to all the books in the British Library. Now, this will be a revolution for democracy and for communality. And of course, it was hijacked by commercial interests and made into an ideological machine and one for pornography. The beginning of the printing press does exactly that, because it's not only the witches, but of course, what drives those printing presses is the ideological war of the Reformation.
Absolutely. And of course, the toxic polarizations between Protestants and Catholics.
Yes, which sounds so familiar.
Absolutely. There's very strong evidence that without the printing press, the wars of religion would not have been nearly as severe. They probably would have happened in some form. They were happening. But, we can draw very strong parallels, I think, with today's toxic polarizations through social media. And of course, I'm not saying these are perfect parallels. I think this is about broadening our discussions and the ways we use history as a thinking tool in a sense. And if I look at your own work, I very much see that it seems to me that a lot of your books and your podcast episodes are exactly exploring that kind of dance between the present and the past, and how can we...
why else would you be interested in the past?
Yeah, that's right. Of course, some people claim, a lot of academics will claim that they are interested in their subject for its own sake. But when you look under the skin or ask them closely, most of them believe that their topics speak to today. If you speak to someone, a historian of 18th century slavery in the Americas, well, the reason they probably went into it, and because they think that it matters, is because it speaks to the racial injustices of our own time. Of course, they may not write that in their academic articles. They slip in a sentence at the end of the journal article. And I think that's partly also why I've written my book. I am not a professional historian. I've got a PhD in political science. I've always been interested in history and have written always through a historical lens and looking at intellectual history. But partly I've built this new book on the brilliant research of scholars in many fields, scholars of witchcraft in the 17th century and of the rise of the first stock markets in Amsterdam, and kept asking myself the questions which they don't always write about, which is, how do these things speak to our time? And of course, there are some historians who very much draw on the past for today. Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, writing about the the misadventures of 20th century interwar fascism and authoritarianism, what we can learn from that. But I've been particularly interested in not so much looking at the warnings of history, but looking at the inspiration. When are the moments when we've managed to act together to overcome crises, confront challenges, build cities and civilizations? So in a sense, slightly the opposite of that famous George Santayana quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Of course, I think we should learn from history to not repeat colonialism and fascism. But let's also look at what went right as well as what went wrong, not with rose-tinted spectacles, but with a recognition that we can learn from those moments of collective solidarity, of positive progressive change, and apply them in some ways today. What do you think? What's your view of that?
Well, I wonder about that, and I really want to explore that with you, because I always feel that I'm slightly more skeptical about that. In a way, the printing press is such a good example, and AI, because they're both disruptive technologies that mean that things as they have been, down to the way we think about things, have to change. With the printing press, the access to information, etc., etc. And disruptive technologies seem to me to disrupt so much more and so much more quickly today than they have been in the past, that we have so much less time to get used to it. You pluck a farmer from a farm in the year 1200 in England, and you drop him in the year 1900 on the same farm, he'll be perfectly happy. He'll know his way around, what to do with the animals and how to use a plow, etc. What I learned about communication technologies when I was 18 was obsolete 20 years later. And I think these changes are happening so much more, so much faster, that yes, of course, there are great examples in history, and I hope we can activate them and use them. But I find that especially with disruptive technologies, we're really in a state of complete and constant oversaturation, more than our ancestors. And personally, I think this will be part of a strategy of coping, to reduce that or to make ourselves more resilient. This is going off on a tangent, but we're allowed, because we can talk about what we like. But
I approve of tangents.
I love tangents, and I've been fascinated by language apps that use AI, and are really very good now. And translations. I used to be a translator. I would never try that again, because I think that profession is basically finished, unfortunately. But I can now speak every language at the touch of a button, which is fantastic. I can talk to someone in Vietnamese or whatnot, just by using a gratis language app. At the same time, of course, if you learn a language, you learn not only how limited you are and how annoying that can be, but also how that experience changes you. That you become more aware of how another culture works, that you become more able to express sides of yourself that you didn't think you had, that you find that your language is better at expressing other things, that, it is a whole experience of widening your own limits and of gaining a new understanding of the world. And the app, of course, cheats you of that experience. So I have a feeling we're going into a world where, thanks to technologies for people who have the means to use them, and not the people at the bottom of the chain that you also describe, who have to do the menial tasks that are still basically too badly paid to automatize. So, AI looks as if it's this sort of amazing spider, but its limbs are actually human. But on the consumer side, we're almost seeming to go to a sort of matrix situation where we're all lying in our pods, fantasizing great worlds that we're in, that are taking place online. And to me personally, the only way that I can think of building some sort of counterweight to that this sounds terrible, but it's true. It's practicing an art or a craft or a sport really intensely, something to do with your analog being, something to do with your body and with other people.
Yeah, and I think that actually directly relates to the history of social media technology as well. I mean, if we think about, for example, well, what might we learn from the coffee houses of the 18th century, for today, for dealing with polarizations, and that idea of the communal table that could be found in the coffee houses of London in the early 18th century was an analog form of the meeting of strangers, where, of course, it was mostly males who met reasonably educated people, but these so-called penny universities where you could pay a penny and get a bowl of coffee and sit on it all day were places where people sat and did discuss anti-slavery, republicanism, the radical ideas that you've written about so much, in the salons of France as well. And, we can then, look to that today, think, okay, how can we revive that kind of coffee house conversation culture? Like Britain has 30,000 coffee houses today. There's been an explosion like in the 18th century. If there were just 10 conversations between strangers a day in those coffee houses, that would be over 100 million a year. And if you believe in the power of ideas to change the world, which I do, and I suspect you do as well, then that's an important sort of thought. And I think, one of the counters to that technological world that you're talking about, communications technology, is the face-to-face which brings that cultural widening. But I think what's also important is to think about history not just in terms of technological innovation and its impacts, but social innovation and its impacts. And my new book really focuses very much on the ways that we've managed to be inventive when it comes to social organization, whether it's the formation of social movements or new ways of managing our resources, new collective ideals. And those are things which I think still speak to us today. So, just for example, in Britain at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about these water monopolies, these companies which, have monopolies over local water supply, which are creaming off super profits, yet dumping raw sewage into the rivers. And again, you can look to the history of water management and see lots of interesting things. So, as you may know, in Valencia, on the city on the coast of Spain, they have this weekly water ritual called the Tribunal de las Aguas, the Tribunal of Waters, which has been meeting every week, every Thursday at noon outside the west door of the cathedral. And it's a water court, probably Europe's oldest legal institution. And these 8 black cloak figures come out. They've been democratically elected by local farmers to manage the scarce waters of Valencia's agricultural hinterland, where we get our Valencia oranges from. And they will find farmers in these public hearings that tourists can watch. They'll find the farmers if they've taken more than their fair share of water. And this institution, a piece of living history, goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. And for me, that's a kind of a social technology, which then we can try and think about today. Well, why don't, like in Britain where I live, why don't we look to managing our water in similar ways? Why don't we have community stakeholder ownership and management of our local waters? Let's get the spark of inspiration from what has happened in the past, and in that case, Valencia still exists in the present. And so in many ways, I think that the purpose of learning from history, or a way of thinking about what's sometimes called applied history, is for those to open up our imaginations, to recognize, of course, that there are differences. Of course, we live in an accelerated age, in so many ways, but we're also stuck with heavy old political and economic institutions which we can rethink. And a lot of these institutions are quite new. Representative democracy, for example, which I think is utterly failing to deal with the ecological crisis, is not designed to deal with that kind of problem. It's only a couple of 100 years old, which I think in terms of the history of political organization is relatively new, and it doesn't have to be this way.
It's not necessarily the only song in town. It's not necessarily the best model we have for democratic governance. And I think that's also an interesting thing to realize. Among the patterns that you identify, and of course you do find some patterns in history that can be applied and reapplied, is are true that say basically every society in which women have a larger say tends to do better, tends to prioritize well-being more than other things, and tends to be slightly more equal. And also, a more equal society tends to be more stable than a very unequal society. That really, I mean, I want you to talk about Kerala and Finland and how they teach us that. But just to put that into a framework, I keep banging on in this podcast about the fact that we are effectively not using the history to go forward in our evolution, but we're using it very much to go back, because our inspiration at the moment in the West seems to be French history before 1789. We're reconstructing an aristocracy. We're reconstructing societies that are radically unequal, in which 1% of the population controls 30 to 40% of the resources, and the bottom 50%. I mean, Austria, it's 4%. I think globally it's 2%. In which a very small caste of people, and it is a caste because you have to be born into it basically, controls disproportionate amount not only of wealth, but also, of course, of political influence and economic decision making, etc., etc. And that seems to me a deeply damaging thing, and indeed a deeply dangerous thing, because it ends the idea of one person, one vote on which democracy is built. And it seems to me to make the reduced democracy to a sort of, marionette theater that happens, but what happens behind the sets is something completely different. Now, you write very eloquently about the significance of relative equity in a society, and you have some very surprising examples.
Yeah, I mean, I'm absolutely with you on the way that we're returning to the old age of oligarchy. Pre-revolutionary France or Latin America throughout the 20th, 19th century. I mean, I wrote my doctoral thesis on the oligarchs of Guatemala, whose, a few families who still control the country, who are rooted in families going back to the 18th century. And I definitely think that we are returning to something of that age in other parts of the world, what I sometimes think of as a K-shaped future, where there's a few people at the top and a lot of people at the bottom and not much in between, which of course was something that Aristotle warned against, that societies without big middles, large middle classes in effect, are very unstable societies. They're not very resilient societies. And if we're thinking of an age of ecological crisis, we need to work out what it is that creates a resilient society.
But it's interesting. It is interesting to know when you say that applies to all kinds of K-shaped societies. They don't need to be capitalist. They don't need to be conservative. They can be feudal. They can be Hindu. They can be whatever they like. It is the fact of inequality, not the ideological context, that defines that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That's a really strong point, and I hadn't thought about it that way, and I think that's correct. And I think, then we need to think about, okay, so if we wanted to overcome these deep inequalities in society, what can we learn from history about that? And I found this a really difficult and disheartening topic, partly because a lot of the scholarly literature on this, I mean, some of the key works like Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, argues that basically we only get a leveling of society, a substantive moves towards equality when there are catastrophic events of some kind. It could be a war, it could be an epidemic, like the Black Death, or it could be a revolution or a state collapse. And when you read those kinds of books, they're very much against the idea of human agency, individual or collective agency. Well, look, all our efforts to try and bring in universal basic income, or trade unions trying to make societies a little bit more equal, these really don't have a hope of making substantive change. And I just think that's wrong. I think if you look at some of the most equal societies today, as you mentioned there in my book, I talk about Kerala and Finland, as Kerala, the state in India, and Finland, two relatively equal societies compared to most others that have transformed rapidly over a period of just a century, from being quite unequal. And Finland was one of Europe's poorest countries at the beginning of the 20th century. And you ask yourself, how have those places become relatively equal? Well, actually, you look at that history, and yes, cataclysmic events like wars have played their part, but so has collective human agency. And you mentioned the role of women in history, a few minutes ago. And I think very much when you look at those two examples, you see the enormous and important role of women's social action activists. Take Finland, for example. You can trace back the origins of today's Finnish relative equality back to many places, but one place you can take it back to is the early 1900s with the rise of the movement for votes for women in Finland, which, like in Britain, split between a reformist movement, which didn't want to make much noise and wanted to give the vote, but maybe only to educated women. And then there was a much more radical wing. And in Finland, the Social Democrat wing of the women's movement, they were on the streets in 1905 when there's a great sort of general strikes in Finland. In 1906, they finally got the right to vote. In 1907, the first parliamentary elections with women. Lots of women elected to the Finnish parliament, and they then played a key role in the construction of the Finnish welfare state. And yes, there are other important moments like the Second World War. As in many countries, returning soldiers wanted to have social housing, social benefits, but then still the women's movements were pushing forward a lot of the healthcare reforms, the rights for women to have access to maternity cover and things like this. What partly, and I think very significantly, came out of social action. Kerala was very similar in India. So I think there's a really important story to tell there about collective agency in the creation of equality. And you look at thinkers today like Thomas Piketty, who increasingly his work emphasizes the importance of social movements for creating the shifts towards more equal societies that we need. So it's not just about crossing our fingers and hoping there's a war that equalizes things, and wars have their problems too. So let's put a bit more faith in human agency. I think that's a relatively fair conclusion to draw from the last 200 or 300 years of at least Western and also parts of non-Western history.
I find that so interesting that you say that, because this is another reason why a book like yours is such a fascinating read. I did a lot of work on the Enlightenment, and they all had their social utopias and their ideas of ideal societies. They all failed for two reasons, I think. One, of course, was that they didn't anticipate an industrial society. They made their predictions for agrarian society, and they didn't see capitalism coming around the corner. But secondly, of course, there's a great difference between them and us, and you are filling that difference because we now have data. We now have, they wrote basically without having history to draw on, because the craft of the historian was just being invented with people like Gibbon and Hume and so. But now we know what happens when you try out this or that in a society. And we know that from many dozens of unwitting case studies of people who have suffered from that. So we no longer need to just to fantasize. But one of those things that you say on the basis of that is disruption works. And that if you want to change things, disruption is the only way to create a sort of point, perhaps that gets us around having to have a war, if we can create the same energy of conflict in a society without actual bloodshed. You also write that you've been to some of the last generation protests. Now, I have myself, when those protests happened, written about them, comparing them to the suffragettes and saying, that was pretty much what happened then, and otherwise there would have been no women's rights if they've stayed sort of polite middle-class women who, had cups of tea. But what is very interesting about the suffragettes is they failed until the First World War. And they failed until the First World War, of course, because then so many men had to be in the army that they had to fulfill certain economic roles, and nobody could say anymore, they can't do that. But also, and I think that is the essential thing, because their years of protests and of disruption had already introduced those arguments into society. So when there was a moment of systemic instability because of the war, those arguments could take hold. And it seems to me that the climate movement is a little bit at that point today, that it's the real function of these protests is not to actually bring about political change, but to establish the arguments in our conversation.
I think your statement that the suffragettes failed is a little bit strong.
Yes, I saw you wince, and I was quite happy about that.
And I think we can come back to that in a moment.
No, but I mean, they didn't, when they protested, Parliament didn't enact those laws.
Right, they didn't enact the rules. That's partly actually why I look at the example of Finland, where the results of their actions were very clear there. And because in Britain, you had that interruption of the First World War. And of course, what would have happened if there hadn't been the First World War? But certainly...
It would have taken them longer, I think.
It would have taken them longer, and I think this comes back to the power of disruption and the importance of thinking about theories of crises in history. Because one of the things that's always frustrated me, just as a citizen, is we have all these crises, ecological crises going on, wildfires in California, melting ice sheets and record temperatures in the Arctic, heat waves across Europe, floods in Bangladesh, and yet still our governments don't act. And that raises the question, what does it take for a government to enact change in a rapid, transformative way? I'm not talking about slow changes. I'm talking about the relatively rapid changes that we need when there are small windows of opportunity before we cross very dangerous tipping points on carbon emissions and biodiversity loss and so on. And the pattern that I see in history is what I call in the book the disruption nexus. So imagine a triangle with three corners to it. In one corner you have some kind of crisis. It could be a financial crash in like 2008 or an ecologically induced crisis like wildfires in California, say. And then the other corner is that you need the disruptive movements which amplify the crisis. So, historically we've seen movements like that, like the civil rights movements and the suffragettes and so on. And the third corner of the triangle are the ideas, that you need visionary, powerful, alternative ideas to the dominant ideas in society. As Milton Friedman famously said, I don't quote him very often, but he said, a crisis is an opportunity for change, but the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around.
Exactly, that's the thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you can look to multiple moments of history where you have a confluence of these three factors. You can look to, say, Britain in the early 1830s. There was an Abolition of Slavery Act in 1833. Now, leading up to that, both the slave owners and the anti-slavery movement in Britain had a very gradualist view of change. They believed that slavery was wrong, but change should only come very, very slowly, because otherwise the economy might collapse and the slaves weren't educated enough to deal with their own freedom. This was not just the slave owners, but the movement itself. And yet something happened. What happened were the great uprisings on the slave plantations in Jamaica in 1831, and other actions as well, but particularly those which, in effect, amplified the crises around slavery, made the elite realize they could lose control of Jamaica, which had hundreds of thousands of British slaves there and in other Caribbean islands, and that, together with the ideas around at the time around universal brotherhood and so on, led to a rapid acceleration, a shift, a disruptive moment. You can think about Berlin in 1989 in the same way. You can think about the civil rights movement in the US in similar ways. So I think there are these strong patterns of these disruptive movements, plus the ideas, plus the crises coming together. And I think you're right. We can look at today, particularly around the ecological crisis, and see why we need movements like Last Generation or Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil. And, I like spending my time in old libraries writing books, but I found myself lying on the street with my 15-year-old daughter in front of the Houses of Parliament in London, with Extinction Rebellion, having commuters honking their horns in annoyance. I know I'm annoying them, but I think our actions are going to be annoying future generations even more, because, again, I can see historically, like you've said, these movements today are the parallel movements of the suffragettes, of the Indian independence movement, and so on. And the tragedy today is that today's ecological protesters are being put in jail, and yet go to my daughter's school and these very same historical equivalent people like Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragette leader, there's a painting of her on the wall at the school being arrested, and we're celebrating them in our schools, yet our legal systems and political systems are putting them in prison. And that, I think, to me shows a profound failure to recognize what makes a healthy democracy, but also it's a failure to recognize how historical change happens. I think it is too risky to leave the great problems of our time to simmer on the low flame of gradualism. I'm not a natural radical person, but I can't see any other option that makes sense given this moment in history where we are. It doesn't mean I'm against slower forms of change too. I think we need to be changing our legal systems and giving rights to future generations. We need to be trying to move towards citizens' assemblies. We need to be seeding new economic models, sort of post-growth models, the well-being economy, donor economics, modern monetary theory. All of these things are part of it, but the disruptive movements are fundamental.
God, so much to ask, so much to say. I just don't know where to start. I love that positive energy. You introduce a word from a great Arab statesman and writer, Ibn Khaldun. You introduce the concept of Asabiyyah into your book, which not many people throw around Arabic concepts and words when they talk about social philosophy. Tell us quickly, because this is so interesting and so important. I've got so many questions to ask about that. What is Asabiyyah?
So Asabiyyah is a concept from the great 14th century Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun, and it means collective solidarity or group feeling. And in 1375, or actually in 1371, Ibn Khaldun, who was a great jurist and a historian, really, one of the first great historical sociologist, one might call him, studying the rise and fall of civilizations. He went into an old castle in what's now Algeria, Western Algeria, and he spent 4 years writing this book called the Muqaddimah, kind of a book about a theory of history. And what he noticed about the rise and fall of civilizations, he was a little bit like Edward Gibbon. You know, when Edward Gibbon went to Rome, he saw these crumbling, old crumbled buildings. He asked himself, what happened to this society? And he later wrote his great book about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Ibn Khaldun was doing the same thing several hundred years earlier. He saw these ruined cities around him in North Africa and thought, what makes them thrive? What makes them decline? And the key concept, Asabiyyah, mentioned 500 times in his book, the Muqaddimah, was about the idea that societies thrive when they tend to have this kind of social glue, a very strong sense of group solidarity. But what tends to happen, and he had a cyclical view of history, that this Asabiyyah tends to be eroded over time, sometimes due to growing inequalities when the rich get richer and want to live more elite lives. The societies become fractured and they become susceptible to the invading forces of outside powers who might have a stronger Asabiyyah, a stronger sense of group solidarity.
Fortunately, there are no parallels at all with our situation today.
Yeah, so I think it's a brilliant concept, I think, to really capture something that we intuitively know, which is that if we want a society or a civilization like ours to survive and thrive, given the kind of threats that it has, one thing it absolutely fundamentally needs is Asabiyyah. It needs some kind of very strong social trust, social cooperation, and it needs something else, which of course is a subject of your new book on subjugation, which is what I talk about as biophilia, which is that sense of interdependence between humans and the living world. This is a second pillar or foundation of civilizational resilience. And then the third pillar, I think, is the capacity to respond to a crisis, which is what my disruption nexus theory is about. Those three things, and Asabiyyah is one of the cornerstones, I think, that we need to think about. How do we create this collective solidarity?
One of the previous guests I've had on this podcast was Olivier Roy, and we had a very interesting conversation. I was really fascinated, and am really fascinated by his idea that what our societies have known as implicit culture has morphed into explicit rules. And just, one image that I think makes that beautifully clear. Think of a traffic intersection in a busy city. Go on YouTube, look at London, and look until the 1930s, and you see really busy traffic intersection with cars and perhaps horse carts and hand carts and bicycles and pedestrians. Not a street sign in sight. Nothing. So everybody is wearing either a long dress or a suit, a three-piece suit, but there are no street signs. In other words, the implicit requirements are very strongly felt. I can't just go out in my underwear. That wouldn't be proper. But nobody needs to tell you from outside, you have to turn right, you have to turn left, stop here, do that. Nowadays, you go on the street and it's the exact opposite. Everybody's wearing what they want, but the street is screaming at them every 5 minutes. Do this, do that, not so fast, stop here, go now. And you have the feeling the whole thing has been turned inside out, and there are only explicit rules to deal with people, because there's not enough as Asabiyyah, I would suppose, to make people function on their own.
I think that's an absolutely brilliant example of it. And I didn't know about that kind of analogy connection. I think it's a really very strong one. And the idea that I think, in many ways, and this is I'm sort of hypothesizing here without having really thought about it properly, but I think some of this has to do with the rise of the stranger in social life. In other words, when we're in societies where we don't know people, when those social bonds aren't so clear, that's when we then start introducing these regulatory mechanisms, whether it's a traffic light or litter rules or whatever it is. And, in my book, I've got a chapter about the period in Islamic Spain in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, sometimes known as the convivencia, the coexistence or living together, when apparently, though there's some discussions about this, Jews, Muslims and Christians managed to live in relative harmony, particularly in big cities like Cordoba in the early 11th century, 500,000 people living there at the time, around about. And I imagine they didn't have many street signs there too, because, they had the interactions of people meeting in marketplaces, in trading with each other, having conversations, maybe having arguments, but that face-to-face interaction, I think, is so fundamental to what Ibn Khaldun later called Asabiyyah. In fact, he wrote about the collapse of Asabiyyah in Islamic Spain in the 13th, 14th century, how the social glue started being eroded. And that's partly what led to the falls of those dynasties in that area and the reconquest by Christians who had stronger Asabiyyah when they reconquered southern Spain. But I think it's really interesting to think about it in terms of a rule-based society. And you might be looking at an institution like the European Union. I'm increasingly a believer in the importance of regulations as a way to create change. How do you create a circular economy where we reuse and refurbish and recycle everything? Well, I don't think an iPhone should be allowed to be sold on the shelves because it uses two-thirds of the elements of the periodic table you can find in an iPhone. It uses precious earth resources and we throw them away after 4 years. And if we want to have a long-term sustainable society, we cannot do that. But we need regulations that say to companies in 5 years' time, sorry, you can't sell an iPhone anymore. You have to sell something like the Dutch Fairphone, which is recyclable, reusable, and so on, much more in line with how we used to refurbish and reuse things.
I would love to circle back to Asabiyyah, but now I do have to ask you something else, which is really troubling me. And I imagine you have a few dinner conversations about that. Your wife's an economist. So we talk about degrowth economies, we talk about circular growth, circular economies. We also live in social states that cost an awful lot of money to run. We have democracies whose institutions are enormously expensive, parliaments, regular elections, court systems, etc. And we have unfortunately now a situation where we actually have to defend ourselves against an aggressor. And that costs insane and indeed indecent amount of money. How are we going to do that all within a no-growth economy? Isn't our entire model, even the good bits of our entire model of living, dependent on this dirty growth? I really don't know a way out of that.
Yes, this is one of the great dilemmas of our time. So for a start, I don't use the term degrowth myself. I don't think that's a helpful framing of where we need to go, partly because I think it confuses people. I mean, what I use is a term post-growth, that we need to move towards post-growth societies where our institutions are not driven by the need for GDP to be ever rising, because ultimately you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. This is the fundamental lesson of ecological economics, which I was never taught when I studied economics 30 years ago, but now is definitely part of the frame in which I think. And the idea of, my partner Kate Raworth developed this concept of donut economics, and amongst many other models of ecological economics, this is one which says we need to get beyond that obsession with growth to have economies that thrive within planetary boundaries. But firstly, it's really important to point out that a post-growth economy is not one that has no growth whatsoever. So you may have some industries that are growing. Your solar panel industry might be growing, but other ones are declining, like the old oil industry or the coal industry. So it doesn't mean there's no shift, there's no innovation, that there's no scope for creating new jobs in new industries. But what you're trying to do is not just grow for growth's sake. You still might be focusing on particular issues like how are we going to create more stable jobs for people so they don't join far-right organizations, which is one of the major causes of that economic instability. You can still focus on those issues by working out how do we have an ecological civilization which provides basic stability, which provides decent jobs, which provides decent housing. These are dilemmas. And as you say, when we have to defend ourselves against Putin or whoever else, it makes it even harder when you are a politician trying to make a decision about how do you allocate a budget. I think where we can see possibilities for change, we see them more at the level of the city-state. At the level of the city, which are a bit like the Renaissance city-states. So take a city like Amsterdam or Barcelona.
Or indeed Vienna.
Oh, in Vienna, yeah. And, you look at Vienna, the way, housing policy works and the pricing of rent in Vienna. And then you look for these other cities which are trying to introduce, limits on, you can't drive a fossil fuel car in Amsterdam, we said earlier, after 2030. Barcelona doing very similar things. They're working with concepts like donut economics. And they're not seeing this as something, and that this is, we have an ecological city or we have one that provides decent employment and housing. This is about doing both. It's about creating a different kind of regenerative economy. So it's a shift away from the basic tenets of capitalism to having more businesses which are steward owned, so that maybe like the clothing company Patagonia is now basically owned by a trust, right? So they are still making money, but it's not their absolute priority, right? And you've got a growth of the steward ownership movement right across Europe and North America. Again, it's a small part of the economy, but you've got companies like Mozilla. You've got other ones as well developing a little bit like the model of, if you go to Emilia Romagna in the region in Italy, where 5 million people live there, and 1/3 of the economy is based on cooperatives and steward-owned companies. This is a very different kind of model, which, again, I'm not saying this answers all of your questions, and politics is about dealing with dilemmas. But I don't think we have to think that a so-called no-growth economy is one that is stagnant, one that is, super problematic. Actually, I think it's where we need to go to in an ecological sense. But we know that growth is actually the kind of growth that we're getting today. Neoliberal growth creates bigger inequalities. Over the last 25 years, 40% of global GDP growth has gone to 1% of the population. Exactly going back to your point about the return of oligarchic kind of feudal society. So I think that it's a necessary kind of shift in thinking we have to move towards. But my hope for change in that economic realm lies much more at the city level than at the national level. I think the innovations we see more in, the equivalent of the Renaissance city-states. And I think in 100 years' time, we probably will have more kind of bioregional city-states. Places like Barcelona will kind of operate more independently, probably. Maybe not be necessarily actually independent, though maybe in Barcelona's case it might be.
This is so interesting, but let me just return to this, I think, so crucial concept of Asabiyyah, because without some kind of communality, without some kind of feeling of cohesion, without some kind of common project, you're not really a society. You're just a bunch of people living in the same place and competing for resources. So we do need that. It seems to me, and I'm not a sociologist, that Asabiyyah is to a very large extent dependent on trust, and that means on legibility. What I mean is that when we two meet, our names, our ages, our way of dressing, our accent, etc., give each other a lot of information about each other. We are readable to each other because we come from the same kind of place. That has traditionally been very important in societies, that people are readable. Now, in industrialized societies with massive migration and urbanization, that means, of course, that traditional identities that made that legibility very easy have been often erased or destroyed. You are no longer from a particular alpine village and you have the religion of your parents and the name of your parents and the profession of your parents. One of the things that has supplanted that to give us a legible identity, a readable identity, is consumption. We have a certain logo on our chest, we choose certain brands, and with that we tell people, we communicate to other people who we are, what we aspire to, how we want to be seen. That seems to me a fairly stupid way of constructing our identity because it's so brittle. Also, an identity based on consumption will be very difficult to maintain when our consumption choices will have to change. And at the same time, I think the huge push of consumption-driven individualism has made this a lot more difficult, being legible for each other and in a meaningful way. And of course, migration has also contributed to that becoming more difficult because there are people in our societies we don't know to read yet, and they perhaps us also not so easily. So how can we, all the models that you propose go towards cooperative ownership, towards a commons, towards shared resources and shared development of these resources with various models such as citizens' assemblies, etc. But all of that is based on Asabiyyah. All of that is based on sufficient social trust. How can we go about getting there?
Yeah, it's a really fundamental and vital question. I love the way that you put it in terms of the legibility or readability. I think, again, trying to take a historical lens on this, we have to recognize that group solidarity, that Asabiyyah, is something that is constructed. So, at the time of the French Revolution, half the population didn't speak French. In the 19th century, French politicians and political culture had to invent the idea of being French. They did it in lots of ways. They invented national songs, statues, a whole kind of mythology about the revolution. And, within maybe a century, that idea, I think you wrote your PhD thesis on nationalism, right? This is the history of nationalism in many ways being about constructing a certain kind of Asabiyyah. The question is where you put the borders. It can be constructed. It's hard to construct fast. And that, I think, is the dilemma. So I think we need to look at our world today and say, okay, given that kind of history, given that we can construct a legibility so that you and I can see each other, or I can look at you sit down with a recent migrant to Britain in a cafe and there's something that we share. How do we do that? And I think this comes to the great dilemma of how Asabiyyah has developed historically. I think there's a strong case to say that at a large scale, that sense of group feeling has often developed when there's been some kind of outside enemy, which makes you forget your differences. Right? And I think that's partly the story of of empires and nationalism. When you've got an outside invader, and then we forget our regional differences, even our dialect differences, our age differences, our economic differences sometimes, and we will fight and die for each other. That's partly what the First World War was about. Now, the problem with the ecological crisis is that we don't have aliens invading us to unite us together, to create that kind of enemy-based Asabiyyah.
Enemy-based Asabiyyah. It's finding enemies. Just I can't resist. Just a little parenthesis. I've written about the First World War, and so I was invited to a German school in August 2014 to talk about the beginning of the First World War. And I was standing in front of a room of 16-year-olds who were completely apathetic and sort of stewing in their hormones. And I thought I have to wake them up somehow. And it was, of course, just after Putin had invaded the Crimea. And so I asked, if Angela Merkel declared war on Putin tomorrow, who of you would volunteer? I was there to talk about the beginning of the First World War.
Great question. And what did they say?
They looked at me as if I'd been transformed into a car. They had, as if I was speaking a completely foreign language. It wasn't that they were pacifists by conviction, thought this is wrong. It was that they didn't understand the question. And then not a single hand showed up when I had repeated the question. I found that fascinating because, of course, their great-grandfathers had all rushed to the enlistment bureaus to be the first at the front. Now, I don't say that that's a good thing, to rush to the enlistment bureau and become a soldier and kill other people. But what has changed in a society if that has become an incomprehensible question? That I found so interesting.
Yeah, that's a really fine point and very important. And it raises the question of, okay, also, even if you had an outside enemy, or if you don't have an outside enemy, where can you find the basis for that social glue that connects people? And where do we look? What could make sense to those kids? Now, of course, one of the important things about social change is that, well, actually, let me go back a step. I think one possible answer to this, and I'm not saying that this is a great answer at all, goes to the idea of thinking about the global environmental movement as a new kind of religion that has emerged since the 1960s. So if you think about it, there are hundreds of thousands of environmental organizations around the world, in the global north and global south. They have vastly different approaches. Some are direct action, we're going to scale up the power plant. Others of them are about planting seeds and conservation. But what they all share is some kind of sense of worship of Mother Earth, the worship of Gaia. They may not write it anywhere on their websites, but actually that's kind of what's going on. And so the way I think of the global environmental movement is as a vast decentralized religion.
I'm advocating in this book that's coming out for a new animism, because I say that animists, they basically knew with every step I'm taking, I'm encroaching on someone else's territory, and I'd better find an arrangement with that someone else, because otherwise this won't go well. So within the ritual of a mythological religion, you then sacrifice a goat or pour a libation or perform a song or whatever your ritual is. But it is the acknowledgement that you're not alone, that you're in a network of intertwined interests that you need to somehow make to harmonize. And it seems to me that modern science is giving us exactly that insight, that we're part of a closed system and whatever we throw away there will come back to us from behind, and that we simply have to understand that whichever step we make, we encroach on the territory of someone else, and we better arrange ourselves with that someone. It's just the vocabulary that's changed from a mythological one to a scientific one. But the insight, as with Lovelock and Gaia, stays relatively stable, actually.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I like that idea of thinking about it in terms through the lens of animism and the language of animism.
It's closed system, basically.
Yeah, and that sense of kind of interdependence. Right now I can see out the window in front of me two giant ash trees. Now, those ash trees provide enough oxygen for 8 human beings. So they are my external lungs, right? My body doesn't, if you get into your head that idea that my body doesn't sort of end with my skin and my bones, which is, we've had at least 500 years of Western individualism telling us this, but that actually the trees are my external lungs, and that every step I take can potentially damage part of myself in effect, if I break its branches or chop it down. Then we start developing a very different way of understanding who we are in a very bigger sense of we, and shifting from the me to the we, shifting from the individual to the collective, shifting from my stuff to some kind of concept of interbeing. And I think this is what we need to build a 21st century society on, these kinds of ideas. So, I like thinking about it, the global environmental movement, as I just said, as a great big decentralized religion without a pope at its center. But I think what's important there, and I think kind of links to what you're just saying, is that if we're going to do that, we need to create new kinds of rituals in society that in a sense go back to pre-Christian rituals of, the worshipping the earth. I went to Stonehenge with my kids on the winter solstice. I went on a pilgrimage walk. We're not religious people at all, but we recognize that if we want to be in a culture,
you need to involve your body. Yes.
Yeah, we need to feel like we're part of that. And I think another key thing about this is not everybody has to take this on in order to create social, political, and economic changes. You don't necessarily need 100% of a population to adopt an idea of radical interdependence with the living world for us to create the institutions that we need to preserve it. You might just need a portion of it. It depends on the political system, the historical context. Maybe you need, the sociologists love coming up with figures. Sometimes you need 3.5% or 25%. I don't believe any of those figures as sort of truths, but we don't need everybody. And I think once you do that, then you can start having the kind of teaching that you need in schools to spread these ideas, so that when you ask the question to the kids, more of them might put up their hand, not to go to war against Putin, but to, be earth defenders, a phrase which is used in Latin American environmental movements. Let us be earth defenders. But the thing is, I can't see how that can happen fast. Right? I can't see how it can happen at the kind of speed that's required, because these are deep changes of Weltanschauung, they're very slow, and that is the dilemma.
Yes, but the dilemma will be met piecemeal and in various ways, more and less successfully, as it always has been. Listen, about this new religion, I'm willing to sign on, but under one condition: it has to be more Greek than Christian. We can't start this thing with the revealed truth and the heretics. If we are going to sort of decent paganism, where we don't do theology but we allow that different gods have all the origin stories they like, and everybody can tell their own story about these gods, then I think I'm on board with you.
And so am I. I'm there. The ancient Greeks had over 50 different water deities and gods. It wasn't just a monotheistic, hyper-authoritarian structure. There was a lot of ability to pick and choose. So let's not be picking and choosing the next iPhone upgrade. Let's choose between the different water gods and see if that can direct us towards a longer now and a bigger here.
Now, this is the first time that we have celebrated water gods on this podcast, but Roman Krznaric, thank you so much. It was a really inspiring and wonderful talk. And I hope you've also had a good time listening to Roman and to me discussing so many things. And well, I'm feeling it was only just a beginning, and we probably have to continue. So thank you for listening. You can like this, you can subscribe to this. Please tell everyone, especially your cherished enemies, about this. We need subscribers. We need to spread the word. Thank you very much.
And thanks so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed the discussion. And let us all remember the great Maori proverb, I walk backwards into the future with my eyes fixed on the past.